Dude, this sounds like a very Soviet approach. Let me take a let me take a like those big rockets that we Americans use those Russian rockets still to lift the heavy stuff up into space because like
This is
Russians
what
are good at that.
SpaceX is, right? This is the SpaceX approach, right? You build
Right.
one engine that lifts X amount of pounds, strap 9 engines to the same thing, it lifts 9 times as much stuff, right?
Hello, folks. I'm really excited today to talk to Anatoly from Solana. Anatoly, someone I met, and when I detected his accent and I asked him where he was from, he said he was from the Soviet Union, and he had me intrigued from the start. And so with that, Anatoly, can you introduce yourself and just give a little bit of background? The company we're talking about today is Solana, but I'm looking for us to get educated about all alternatives in this space. And I can't think of someone better to be schooled by than Anatoly, because he schooled me.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, so I'm Anatoly. I'm co-founder of the Solana protocol, and Solana is a blockchain, an open permissionless smart contract platform, much like Ethereum, but fundamentally different design. So the kind of goal we're trying to achieve is this goal of open permissionless, but also scalable and cheap, big enough for the entire globe to handle all of the world's financial transactions.
Tell me about some of the transaction throughput levels you're getting and compare that to some of the alternatives from Bitcoin to Ether to Ripple.
Yeah.
Just to give people, and also mention Visa, just to put yourself on the map of where you guys are and where theoretically where you can go.
So kind of, the best foot forward we can place would be a test that we could run on a high-end network like Google Cloud or AWS. It doesn't matter if it's co-located or distributed, but with beefy machines, we've seen performance over 100,000 TPS. The number that we like to claim is 50,000 TPS, and by transactions per second, these are atomic cryptographically signed transactions where a transfer occurs from one party to another, so from one public key to another.
And just give a comparison, because I think that number puts you in a competitive range with a commercial network like Visa, which is done it old school, but also way beyond the other alternatives out there that are more traditional. So just put some numbers on that.
Yeah, so Bitcoin and Ethereum, Bitcoin's at 7 transactions per second, Ethereum's at 11. Networks like EOS, Ripple, and kind of Tendermint, based proof of stake networks range somewhere between 200 to 300 TPS at peak times. So we are one of the first solutions that really kind of we bought into this idea that you can scale this entirely with hardware. So my background and kind of most of the team are former Qualcomm folks. We were there from, I was there from like 2003 till 2015. What I remember is starting with those flip phones, which were like 16 megabit, 200 megahertz, 2 megabytes of RAM devices. And in the span of 10 years, having a supercomputer in my hand, relatively, like, 64-bit, 8-core, 4 gigabyte systems, which were much as powerful as desktops or laptops. And this is what kind of like, this was the, what was my kind of experience dealing in that space was that when there's demand for something, there's 2 million people working on optimizing silicon, networking, GPU cards, whatever it is that you want. If there's enough demand for it, there's enough hardware out there to kind of scale this. So the bottlenecks that we're dealing with are cryptographic operations, like how many signature verifications can you do per second? And then how much of this information can you transmit as fast as you can around the world? And how much of this memory can you store? And all of these things are doubling every 2 years, right? Like at a kind of an unfathomably fast pace. So this is what we're betting on. And so far it seems that we've been right. And we started with needing like 4 GPU cards to get to 1 million signatures per second. Right now you only need 1, and that gets you 7 million per second. And for normal operations, you don't even need GPUs anymore.
Dude, this seems like a very Soviet approach. Let me take a let me take a like those big rockets that we Americans use those Russian rockets still to lift the heavy stuff up into space because like
This this is
Russians
what
are good at that.
SpaceX is, right? This is the SpaceX approach, right? You build
Right.
one engine that lifts X amount of pounds, strap 9 engines to the same thing, it lifts 9 times as much stuff,
Excellent.
right?
So let me go back and so my journey and I met you along the way in this journey. I'm an old guy, so I went back to ancient history when there was something called proof of work. Then I stumbled across something called consensus in a poker game, which led me to Ripple. I met Juan Bennett like at Y Combinator, and that was like I read a white paper about proof of stake. And then I met you and read a white paper about proof of history. So between those four big concepts, could you give your view of kind of a walk through the history path that I've been and what each of those meant, and why you're where you are today, how you got to the concept of proof of history, because that's what I glommed onto when I met you, was that
Yeah.
white paper on proof of history. But go back in time and give us a walk through history.
Um, so proof of work is this idea that really kind of took off with Bitcoin. There have been other kind of iterations of it, but the main idea there is that it's really hard to know identities on the internet. There's an arbitrary number of people. People can have as many Reddit accounts, as many Facebook accounts. They can create a ton of Twitter bots and followers. It's really hard to know whether one vote on the internet is actually one person. So this problem of it's called the Sybil resistance problem. How do I actually attribute value to a voice on the internet? It's a very challenging and hard problem, and people have been dealing with this since the birth of the internet, because as soon as there was email, you start getting 1 million emails per day of stuff that you didn't want. and this is what's called spam. And even out of the email research, folks kind of started thinking, well, what if it made it cost a little bit to send one of these messages, to actually vote? And one of the ideas they came up with is proof of work, which is I can force you to solve a cryptographic puzzle that takes you some amount of energy to solve, but takes almost no amount of energy for me to verify. So if it takes you like 10 cents of electricity to solve this puzzle, it takes me, 1/1,000,000th of a cent of electricity to verify it. And therefore, I can kind of remove the amount of junk that I'm getting. And some very smart folks that were working in like the cypherpunk movement and working around this idea of self-sovereign money and digital cash, they kind of put all these things together and came up with proof of work and Nakamoto consensus. And it's kind of it's a magical construction, right? It like works so beautifully that it's really hard to it was, to me, not so much invented but discovered, right? It's like one of those things that is very, very clever, that seems obvious in retrospect. And the idea there is that we can create security by using this proof of work puzzle, and by forcing the vote, or how much anybody in the internet agrees of to be a thing of a certain state. Like for whether the sky is blue or red, it doesn't matter, but we can all kind of agree that it took 10 kilojoules of electricity to create that voice, to create that vote. And once we have that Sybil resistance, we can all agree on a ledger, right? Like a set of accounts and who has what amounts. And as soon as we have that, we kind of have this idea of financially or economically secure money, because it costs some amount of dollars to go take that electricity and convert it into this puzzle. And this system, I think it was a combination of the 2008 financial crisis and this kind of very clever, easy to work with system that really took off, and Bitcoin kind of came out of this. The really hard problem here is these networks that rely on proof of work, they're communication networks. Communication is like an old school problem. So back in the day, people discovered radio, and they figured out that if two radio towers transmit at the same time over the same frequency, you get noise. So if you have Bitcoin, which relies on this proof of work puzzle to transmit information, if you have enough participants in the network that they all start transmitting information at the same time, you get forks, or effectively you get noise. So the network is in this noisy state where nobody knows what is the actual final state of the ledger. Like, I don't know if the transactions that Greg thinks are the right ones that we should actually encode, or the transactions that Anatoly says are the right ones. If both of us claim to be like, okay, here's my copy of the ledger, and here's my electricity, but if that voice occurs at the same time, we still have to figure out who's right. So to deal with this problem, and like how most random transmission protocols work with, is they force the users to wait and to transmit at a frequency that the likelihood of a collision is really low. So proof of work, this is the difficulty adjustment. So when more voices come into the network and more voices want to vote and select transactions and what actually means that somebody spend money, when that number gets so large, that network adjusts the difficulty or the amount of electricity it takes to create a vote, such that only one vote is created every 10 minutes. 10 minutes is a long time for computers. It's a long time for global networks. It's an incredibly fast amount of time when you're dealing with a banking system, that I can wire you arbitrary sums of money and it takes 10 minutes, right, for you to receive it. That's crazy, right? And a lot, if you ever bought a house or dealt with any kind of like financial transactions that are interesting, you kind of realize, okay, that takes a day to do with a lot of paperwork. Bitcoin takes 10 minutes to get that signal, right? And it's a bit more complicated than 10 minutes, but effectively, like you get a lot of security just from that one single voice, a single vote. Unfortunately, the world is so big and connected that Bitcoin, while I think phenomenally is proven to work for large transfers between, China and the US, I can send $1 billion and in an hour, that you got it. $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. It doesn't really work well for very small, like Venmo style, Visa style transactions, or things that like traditional finance does a really good job at, like the New York Stock Exchange. Just simply the amount of data that needs to be transmitted is so large that those 10-minute intervals are just not, are too slow. And Bitcoin can't really be competitive in that sense. And folks at Ethereum that had this vision of a universal computer that can really run arbitrary computation, you can run exchanges in it, you can build lending protocols. They've optimized proof of work, I think, to its maximum limit. And that time frame is shrunk from 10 minutes to 12 and a half seconds. And the result of that, I think, if people have seen, is that there's a massive amount of innovation that happened in Ethereum. I think like phenomenal amount of adoption, considering how difficult it is to understand any of this stuff, how cryptography, how hard it is for normal humans. I think like Ethereum is just awesome, like in every sense of the word. But because it is still based on proof of work, and because it's dealing with these fundamental limits of communication, when you have arbitrary people transmitting information, it's stuck with this 12 and a half second limit. And because of that, right now, due to the awesome adoption that Ethereum is seeing, a single message costs $12 to $30 to send.
Right.
And that basically rules out almost every kind of use case, right? Most of my Venmo transactions are under 30 bucks, right? So for normal humans, it quickly became kind of too expensive.
Give a quick, consensus came along under Ripple, and why that's an optimization, not an optimization at the level that you're doing, but just from a history point of view, you want to talk about consensus and then maybe on
to
proof of stake?
So consensus is kind of an old idea. There's been papers about this stuff since probably before the 70s, but definitely like the ones that I'm aware of are 70s and 80s. And there's been technologies built that dealt with consensus one way or another, and wireless cellular networks definitely implement forms of consensus with various degrees of fault tolerance and reliability. So in '99, there's this paper published called Practical Byzantine Fault Tolerance, which really describes in steps, this is what you need for networks for a network of users or participants to agree on a single bit on some state. And this is very similar to the same problem that, agreeing on a ledger or agreeing on a set of accounts that Bitcoin implements. The problem, though, that PBFT or Practical Byzantine Fault Tolerance didn't really address is this idea of a vote. How do we know who's actually voting? How do we know how to agree on this on the number of participants? And I don't know if Vitalik was kind of the first person to put these two together, but he basically said, well, you have digital currencies like Ethereum, and there's public keys that control that. Why don't we call that as the set of possible votes? And then when somebody votes, actually put up their currency that's part of the system, part of the universal computer, and that's their voice. And we know because of cryptography, we know because of this computation is secure and reproducible, that nobody's double voting. And if we can detect that people are double voting, that I vote for Greg's ledger and then I also vote for my own at the same time, we can create proofs that they've done so and punish them. And this was kind of, to me, this was a like controversial idea at the time, I would say. And a lot of folks, I think, in the space, Ripple and a bunch of other more practically minded folks that were not, maybe not as hardcore Bitcoin maximalists, thought that, oh yeah, this works, right? This is PBFT with some weighted ability to weight the participants in the network, and those weights can adjust because this currency can exchange, and you have some limits about how fast I can create my vote and remove it. And why don't we just go implement it and build stuff, right? And Ripple actually ended up being more of a quorum-based system, which has a more different set of rules about to discover who are the set of participants and how each one decides the weight of all the participants. But at the end of the day, you still have X amount of voters, and some majority of them have to agree on what is the current state of the network. So in some ways, this reduces this problem of needing energy, right? Like I don't need to go find a bunch of electricity to create a vote. I'm simply kind of have some currency that are assigned to me, or I acquire it financially, and then I can create this voice. But that doesn't really address the communication problem. And while these networks are faster than proof of work, because they're not as concerned about forking, the way that they're implemented is they're typically sequential. Like Tendermint specifically is maybe the easiest one to understand. You have a set of participants around the world. There's a single block producer that says, here's the block, everybody agrees. And there's a certain timeout whether the network agrees on that block or doesn't. And then the next block producer goes. So going back to that radio example, this is not how cellular networks work. So right. I even though I didn't work on radio and wireless protocols at Qualcomm, I was just there long enough that this is just something that I observed through osmosis. And really the first intuitive thing that you can think of is two radio towers transmit at the same time or the same frequency. Why don't we give each tower a clock that's synchronized and they alternate by time?
This is beginning to foreshadow this concept of the clock. So like so keep going with your story, because
yeah,
because it is a story, and that's what captivated me. It's a story.
So this idea is called TDMA, time division multiple access. This was the foundation of 2G networks. If you remember those, like kind of in mid 90s, they allowed millions of people to talk to each other around the world. And in fact, like CDMA, LTE, 5G, they all still have this TDMA component. The first thing that you do is you alternate by time, and then you do very clever frequency allocation and time allocation and scale this between multiple radio antennas, and it's just more engineering. But at the end of the day, you can't have two things transmit at the same time or the same frequency. You get noise. That idea is still there. So I was actually in 2017. I was, the reason I became more interested in crypto than I was before was that I was actually interested in machine learning and deep learning. And a friend of mine and I started buying deep learning hardware and putting them in like data centers to build this kind of like side project, because while we were not, you know, serving machine learning jobs, we could mine crypto and pay for the capital costs of this hardware.
Who was paying for the electricity? You guys paid for your own electricity, or just kind of?
No, we paid.
A few moments later.
Hey guys.
You're there.
Back. Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
You got cut off for there, but you were starting to talk. We're talking about really, I guess, multiplexing. So back to where you were when you were putting these machines into the data centers. Machine learning.
Yeah. I wasn't thinking about building a blockchain. I was simply thinking like how to use cryptocurrency, and I started really kind of getting deeper into what is proof of work and why does it work, why is it necessary. And one day I had like 2 coffees and a beer, and I was up till 4 in the morning because the mixture kind of like didn't sit well with me. And I had this eureka moment that using the same puzzle that's used to measure electricity or to do the Sybil resistance step in proof of work, you can tweak that puzzle and just measure passage of time. So that's not sufficient to create a vote or create a voice, right, to do the Sybil resistance check, but it's sufficient to create an understanding of time in a trustless way. That the problem with like why TDMA doesn't work for Bitcoin is because somebody has to go say, this is the clock and everybody should trust my understanding of time. And if you have this kind of third party that dictates time in the network, it can no longer be truly a decentralized system, because that third party can really decide the order of all the events, right? If this is an exchange, whoever controls the clock controls all the trades. So because I knew that I kind of had that part of the puzzle figured out, that really like, I honestly couldn't like sleep for a week. I was like, oh man, I've got it. Like I've solved this whole problem. Like you can actually take all the stuff that we worked on at Qualcomm for like decades to optimize these systems, and you can then apply all that technology, all that knowledge that is basically standard engineering, and scale cryptocurrencies to, you know, whatever limit that you want. Like if you need to handle 1 million transactions per second, you just need hardware and software, and that's it, and a source of time.
So my understanding is you can take a second and break it down into how many discrete events. That's kind of how I'm thinking about what you're doing.
Yeah, so the idea here is SHA-256, which is the hash function that's used in the proof of work puzzle. In proof of work, you try to run it with as much parallelism, using as many CPU cores and as much electricity as you can to find this like hidden kind of golden ticket. So everybody in the world right now, there's, you know, one nation state full of electricity that's being spent to mine Bitcoin. In proof of history, you run this puzzle. You don't run a puzzle, you just run it sequentially, and you just generate you take SHA-256 and you take its output and use it as the next input. And because this SHA-256 is a cryptographically secure, pre-image resistant hash function, there's no way for you to speed this process up significantly. You can super cool your chip. You can maybe build a 20% faster chip, but those improvements are maybe like 2 to 3x at best. And because we have this kind of, we understand the bounds in this, and those bounds can't be 100x or 1000x or arbitrarily large. We can use that as a proof that you have waited a certain amount of time before you transmit your block. So the idea here is pretty simple, right? If we have this global network, you and I basically are assigned a different amount of data that we need to generate, different number of sequential hashes. And when I get to my number, I get to transmit a block. And because they're different, we don't overlap in real time, and the number of forks is reduced, and therefore our block times in Solana are 400 milliseconds.
Right. For everybody, that's 4/10 of a second, correct?
Right. And exactly, right. And compared to
And
Ethereum's,
so I just want to put it out here. So in 4/10 of a second, you can do 50,000.
no, well, 50,000 transactions. Yeah,
per second.
so about 50,000 per second, 4/10 of a second. You can
So
have
about
a point where
20 or 20,000 plus per cycle.
And that limit of how many events you can stuff in there, that's basically how good is our software at taking advantage of multi-core systems, CPUs, memory, disk, because you're not just dealing with a transfer of dollars between user A and user B. Everything gets complicated immediately. As soon as you give people the tools, they'll want to build something interesting. So Serum is a central
talk a
limit
little
order.
about Serum.
Okay.
Talk about Serum.
So I don't know if you remember my seed funding slides, but I had these cheesy slides in there that said Solana is blockchain at NASDAQ speed. That I wasn't really thinking about Visa. What I was thinking about was, imagine a world where you have this network, this decentralized network, and in theory, the way that state transitions or the way that transfers or programs propagate through this network can be as fast as news travels around the world. So some important event happens in Hong Kong, that information goes speed of light through fiber. That event that represents that state transition travels through Solana at speed of light through fiber. A trader at the New York Stock Exchange that has a Blue Book terminal, right, sees that newswire, they should see the same price at the New York Stock Exchange as a market on Solana. So while the New York Stock Exchange can do this sub 1 millisecond trading, those trades are really trading on statistical noise in the order queue. There's a bunch of retail and order flow that's going into the New York Stock Exchange from brokers, etc. It's not newsworthy trades, it's just statistical noise, right? But some event happens, that information that's really important to the markets, it can't travel faster than it takes for that to go, right? There's no way to do it, right? Speed of light is still the bound. In theory, we can be as fast as the news. So in theory, for all the key important kind of price moving trades, Solana can serve as a global price discovery engine. And this idea I thought was going to take 5 to 10 years to even convince somebody it was real. When I talked to you guys were like, okay, but can you just do what Visa does?
Right.
Well, that was an
intermediate. And can you also just talk about, we're not just fast, but we're talking about cheap, because we're not using up all the electricity. Just talk about the cost per transaction of Solana and why that makes you so competitive with Ether.
Yeah, so the costs are basically bounded by the cost of bandwidth. So when Vitalik came up with this thing called the trilemma, and what the trilemma talks about is there are trade-offs between security, decentralization, and basically the cost to run the network, the dollar spent on it. And that trilemma is bounded by the bandwidth available to all the nodes in the network. But the thing is that bandwidth is one of those things that gets cheaper over time. So Ethereum, I don't know, because of their belief that you need to kind of run on the cheapest possible hardware out there, really went in this technology called sharding, which is trying to build two networks that can somehow automatically verify that the other network hasn't committed fraud, and then try to scale it up to maybe 1,000 networks. Because I spent my career at Qualcomm and I saw how fast things went from flip phones to 4K video in the palm of your hand, I kind of see that the writing is on the wall for the cost of any of this stuff. And even today, bandwidth is about $50 a terabyte. If you have 10,000 computers, all of them spending $50 a terabyte. And I want to send a transaction from myself, right, to Greg. The cost of that transaction should really be the cost to me to send that message to 10,000 computers. So I tell all 10,000 of them, hey, I'm going to transfer, $5 from my account to Greg's account. All 10,000 of them replicate the computation, and they can batch that and then agree, okay, everybody sent us all the messages. We have all the data. Let's move the ledger forward. So what's the cost of that message to me? 10,000 sounds like a lot. It's actually like 10 to the minus $7 for a single transfer. Because bandwidth is so cheap. Right?
All right, so I want to take a pause on the history, but I want to go to your personal history. Just go way back. Where were you born? What was your upbringing, and how the hell did you get here and get to me in front of Digital Garage? I don't remember quite how we ended up sitting across the table from each other, but I do remember that moment. But I'm curious as to what happened from all the way back to when you were born.
I was born in the Soviet Union in Odessa, Ukraine, where kind of a city where they're known for its corruption and kind of like humor. It was kind of like the black sheep of the Soviet Union.
Isn't that where they hold the conventions for the black hats, for where you can get all the stolen credit cards and what? I thought they actually had those conventions.
I don't know. I don't know if that was happening in the USSR because there was no credit cards at the time.
Well, I mean, basically that's where you could go from pre-Silk Road. They used to have, that was the clearinghouse for black hat information on the internet.
Possibly.
Okay. All right. Well,
so
maybe that's a factoid. Keep going. So you were born there, but somehow you got over here. What happened in between?
Yeah, my parents moved to the States in '92, right after the fall of the Soviet Union. So they basically kind of like saw the signs of, like, nobody was like a believer in communism. That's why everybody left. Like, everyone intelligent like saw that system not working. And as soon as they had the opportunity, they were able to leave. And I grew up in Chicago area, went to school at Urbana-Champaign, and started studying computer science. And the reason I ended up at Qualcomm was that, I had a startup working on building voice over IP systems, and they had during a job fair, they were building their voice over IP system using the same stack, and they kind of hired me in the spot. So this was post 2001 crash, like around 2003, and I was in the Midwest trying to build basically Google Grand Central Dispatch or Vonage, equivalent of like programmable phone calls, right? Huh. If I had any sense, I would have went to the Bay Area, got funding, but at that time, the way I thought that you could build a business was to bootstrap it, right? Get customers and then kind of grow it from there. And that was really tough, right? Like you kind of, the idea that like venture capital can take it like technology and scale it globally. I think that was still pretty unproven, especially after the .com crash. There were definitely believers of this, right? People that, obviously a ton of investment happened afterwards in internet companies and web scale companies, but this was something that like post.com crash, one of my teachers told me that maybe computer science is not a good career choice.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
But at least the telecoms were kind of a safe haven. They took a beating then, but there was work to be done, and mobile technology was coming along.
People like, cell phones were still kind of a new thing. And the group that I ended up with in the idea that you can have programmable platforms, mobile platforms, where somebody would write a program that would get distributed to a mobile phone in your hand. That was a wild idea. That took a lot. That people didn't really understand it. Like companies like Facebook rejected it like wholeheartedly. They're like, oh, no one's ever going to use this, right? Like, so even like the smartest people at the time, right, like didn't see the writing on the wall.
I think
for like,
Facebook thought everything was going to be HTML5, right?
Yeah. So I ended up kind of working on operating systems and building and like really um, learning how to do optimizations and like understanding hardware and software and where latencies and performance kind of all meet and fit. And I to like the coolest thing to me was just watching how quickly the hardware iterated during that time, because demand for cell phones and cellular technology was just so large. Literally, like the adoption of mobile was like moved at an astounding pace. You went from like tens of millions of people using it to everybody in the world using it, right, in a decade. Just kind of a crazy amount of work that was put into it.
What's a really different path because of your like operating systems was for a while sort of a backwater, the focus on hardware that was like from another era, and yet it's led you to come up with this whole different approach around proof of history, which relies on some very keen concepts of what you can do with really low level
Yep.
architectural concepts and hardware and parallelization, and metaphors you got from the cell towers ones is really, really interesting. And so I understand now that you guys have processed transactions that maybe more transactions than Ether has. Just want to talk a little about the stats and when you guys went live with your mainnet and like kind of where you guys are on your trajectory, your developer community, some of the different kinds of applications that are getting built on Solana. Just give people a little feel for what trajectory you guys are on.
So yeah, we were we were always like we never raised a large amount of money. We always raised barely enough, and that put a lot of pressure on everybody to ship as fast as we could, and probably kind of saved our butts. So we were one of the first next generation blockchains to launch, and that was March last year. So 2017 was when all the funding came into next gen blockchains. But because this stuff is so complicated and you're literally building a new operating system or a new database from scratch, that usually takes 10 years. Like MongoDB, like NoSQL, like those technologies took 10 years to build. So we were able to launch in about 2.5 years, and it's mainnet beta. And I'll describe why we're still calling it beta in a little bit, but it's fully functional, feature complete, and fast. And we had this demo where if you go to break.solana.com, you pay like 10 cents and you smash your keyboard and you see transactions being sent. They go into a smart contract, and then those boxes turn green and they're finalized. And I showed this demo to Sam, who is the CEO of FTX in Alameda, and he was like, "Okay, this stuff works and it's live."
Mm-hmm.
They had the same kind of idea that, okay, if you can make this technology work, there's probably going to be a decentralized exchange in the style of real exchange, which is a central limit order book, which has a price time queue, where market makers like Jump Trading, like Alameda, can put capital at risk, and money can like trade, right? And information can actually like price discovery can occur. This is something that they've been trying to build on Ethereum and a bunch of other networks for over a year. And
But
when I
it's too
showed them that,
slow.
yeah, but none of that stuff worked. When I showed him this, and I kind of like told him the story, look, right now, like we started with 4 GPU cards. We only need 1 now to get 4 times as much cryptography throughput. Every time there's more SSDs, we double. Every time there's more cores, capacity doubles. This technology can basically scale to cover the entire world. And this was ambitious enough for them to kind of bite. And the fact that it worked, that it was live. It was out of the white paper stage. So in about 4 weeks, their engineers are remarkable. Knowing nothing about Solana, it's nothing like Ethereum. There's had zero developer experience in the stack. In 4 weeks, they built a central limit order book exchange that's about to hit $1 billion in total volume traded, and since basically August.
I hear you guys have made it tough for developers, right? Aren't all your specs written in Russian or something? No, but I hear it's not as spoon fed as Ether for the developers.
Yeah.
What's the story with that? You guys have put it all about performance, and
Yeah, so you
Yeah.
this is kind of the birth of mobile programming, right? You started with C, which is Brew, which is the OS that I built, and
Mhm.
as the hardware improved, you had more capacity, and Apple was able to ship Objective-C as their development environment, and Android was able to ship Java, and those technologies just take more resources, and you kind of see the same trajectory with us. Much faster though. It's not going to take 10 years. So Rust was the primary developer language. It's the fastest one. We have a team building an EVM implementation in Rust that just runs as a smart contract on Solana. So imagine, as a smart contract, you can run the Ethereum virtual machine, and then it can do whatever Ethereum does. And this little sandbox is not sharded. It's part of the same state machine. It's just going to take a bit more gas. And that's okay, because every 2 years we get twice as much gas, right?
Right. And there's something like over 300 projects now built on. Talk about the and I've seen them be everything from wallets to like mechanisms for artists, like having
Yeah,
content. Talk a little
yeah.
about some of the projects.
We just like we kind of took this approach of building all the tools that developers need. So you don't need to write a smart contract to build an exchange. Serum already did that, and we have all the APIs for you to take that existing protocol and integrate it into your product. So this other team called Solable, they took that market, the same sophisticated financial market that jump trading is market making in. They're using it to sell artists like non-fungible tokens, which is cool, right? This is kind of like the most amazing part about the space is this open source reusability. As soon as you figure something out, right? As soon as like Avi figured out lending, anybody can go take that lending protocol and scale it to every possible use case. Same thing on Solana, except not only can you scale it to every use case, you can then scale those use cases to 1 billion people. So because we have the capacity to handle that many accounts. One of the projects that's moving over, Kin, they were running effectively a private fork of Stellar in like their own private database, because they have 55 million accounts, which is the size of Ethereum. And their transactions are micropayments between users in their ecosystem for jokes, for like memes, for like simple things like, 10 cents per message. There's just no way you can take that use case, which is awesome, but like kind of like the best part of the internet is people like, sending pictures of cats to each other. You can't take that and then run it in Ethereum or anything else where that's expensive. So we were able to migrate them because we have that capacity to, sure, dump as many accounts as you want and use the message bus, the same one that has to be cheap enough for a market maker to do a price update, right? Not just a trade, right? But like, I just want to cancel an order that can't cost me $10, right?
Right.
Like that has to execute now.
So look, you're not alone in this space. There's like Polkadot, a couple of others. Just talk about the who's who in this space of the faster blockchain, and just kind of like how do you handicap those different players, and just educate me a little bit.
There's a lot of, I think, really talented and smart folks. So who is our arch nemesis? Funny thing is, like us as engineers, we all like each other because we're all like working on hard problems, and we just have a different idea and different vision. Avalanche is I don't know if you heard of that one. That's a totally different approach that is probably a really well optimized random transmission protocol. And there's actually an analogy to this in wireless networks called AlohaNet, which was discovered in Hawaii and is actually still part of every wireless network out there, because that's a really great control channel. So they're working on a system that is like has low latency, cheap transactions, but because of they're not as focused on hardware scaling, they are using a technique called computation sharding in these subnets where only part of the network does the heavy lifting for the processing, something like an exchange. And like Polkadot did a remarkable job in bringing a ton of new developers in China. Like Gavin was a co-founder of Ethereum. He basically moved to China for 3 years and had this vision let's build a network where anybody can create also a subnetwork similar to Avalanche, with slightly different mechanisms, and can run their own blockchain, and all of this technology is shared between applications. On the tech side, I think like all these approaches with sharding, whether you're doing computation sharding or state or bandwidth, they work well for a single application, but they lose this kind of magic thing that Ethereum has right now called composability, where you have a protocol like Aave with its own set of users that automatically plugs into Uniswap, and then like an aggregator like 1inch can actually route orders between all of those things. And all these applications exist on a single network. If you ever like, if you by choice, right, if you actually split those apart, then communication between all those subnetworks would take, you know, additional 5 to 10 seconds, and then the user experience becomes really, really awful, right? And like you kind of lose this magic ability to take and combine pieces and scale them into like new applications. So this is like the hard part of all these trade-offs. Our main trade-off is that the validators or the machines to run this stuff just cost more. You have to go get those chips, get that memory, and you got to pay for it.
What kind of cost are we talking about? Just put some numbers around.
These are systems that are about like $5,000 to $10,000 a system. So they're not like 50,000 IBM like blades or anything like that, but they're somewhere like an expensive gaming PC. So these are off-the-shelf components anybody can go buy, but they're not like a Raspberry Pi that, you know, you can effectively give out for free. The interesting thing is that like on paper, something like a PlayStation 5 has the capacity to do that.
Oh, wow. It's that powerful.
Yeah, like a PlayStation 5 is almost perfectly optimized for this because it's got really high memory bandwidth. So if anyone's listening to this that's got access to a PlayStation 5 developer kit, just reach out to me. Like I would love to go porter validator software on a PS5.
Just tell us a little bit about your team. Like who else is on your team? How big's your team? What's coming up next for your team?
Yeah, we're so I got super lucky with the folks that joined early on. This was again luck of circumstance. 2018, Broadcom tried to buy out Qualcomm, and they literally called the president to stop that acquisition.
Wow.
And there was kind of low morale there, and I was able to kind of poach a bunch of my colleagues, like principal engineers, senior directors of technology, not like managers, like a senior director that was still coding 80% of their time. Folks that are really like there to drive tech forward. So those first like about 8 people were just like the best folks that I worked with at this 30,000 person company that were experts in operating systems, networking, GPUs, compilers. Like I couldn't have imagined a better team to go build this. And we had a ton of kind of tribal knowledge between us, so we were able to just execute. Like it was like putting the band back together in a lot of ways.
How big is the team now?
We're about 35 people if you count kind of like all our full-time contractors and stuff.
And I know I take it everything's happening virtual, but where are you guys going to be located going forward? Are you in the Bay Area?
We were never like had a central office because I was in San Francisco where I was connected to venture capital and I was able to raise funding, but most of the team was split between San Diego and Boulder, which is where Qualcomm has offices. Okay. And then when we started hiring, it just was remote first anyways.
And just on that, did you guys do a regular equity? I think for us, our investment company, Hard Yak, we bought tokens, but did you do an equity raise too, or was it all tokens?
It was all tokens. So this is kind of one of the hardest things that are still, I believe, like needs a ton more development is how should these like early stage cryptocurrencies, which are kind of half public good, half venture fundable thing, how could they be funded early on? Before they're launched, right? Once they're launched and once they exist, you're kind of in a different game where you have decentralization and governance, and it becomes its own ecosystem thing, right? Like that's that you can compare to Ethereum, but like when it's just a white paper and an idea, how do you actually like get enough people together and pay them an engineering salary to go do this for 2 years? That's like a kind of a tough problem that I think hasn't really been solved yet.
Interesting. And so milestones coming up, what's in the docket for the next year ahead or 5-year plan? Like I know Soviets always have a 5-year plan. Tell me the 5-year plan.
We are,
unless you have to kill me after telling me.
Yeah, we're so allergic to planning. Everything's done open source. Yeah, we've gotten pretty good at like fire-driven development, where we are so focused on like it's fairly easy, like with the direction we're going. It's just make the system faster. Well, and I don't know, that's like the only thing I have to tell like all the engineering folks. Look, it's 400 milliseconds now. We need to get it down to 200 milliseconds, and do whatever you need to do to get that. So it just means do more analysis.
So it sounds like you single-handedly rescued Moore's law. I thought 10 years ago we were told we were at the limit of Moore's law, but you guys seem to have like taken it from the graveyard, dusted it off, and put it on the altar.
It's never gone away. It's never gone away. The folks that claim it's dead mostly talk about frequency, like how much cycles can you do per second on a single core. And that's actually what we rely on as a security for proof of history, is that part of Moore's law is dead. Frequencies are not going to get to 100 gigahertz anytime soon.
So help me out here on the future. Is quantum computing a real thing? Is it going to happen, or is that just a pipe dream? Tell me.
My feeling is that it's still a pipe dream. I hope that it happens in my lifetime, because I think that would be kind of, again, one of those magical things that if you've seen like some of the quantum algorithms for rendering and things like that, it behaves more like simulation of the real world than what like PlayStation 5, how it like approximates the real world. It's kind of wild. So I
was hoping you were going to tell me. I thought you were going to tell me that you have a white paper sitting in your desk that's going to explain how it works.
No,
busy, well, and you haven't finished the white paper yet.
Long-term goal for Solana is to get so much demand that it's worthwhile for us to invest in neutrino-based communication networks, which cut through the center of the Earth, so those block times can be 40 milliseconds instead of 80. That's right. That's our long-term goal, right? Can we get so much demand that it's worthwhile to build up?
Very good. All right, Anatoly, I think we're at the end of our hour. It's been great catching up. I will never forget the day when you told me you were from the Soviet Union, because that really caught my attention. I don't even know, how did we get hooked up? Did I find you? Did you find us?
I played this sport called underwater hockey.
Yep.
And there's a mutual friend of mine at 500 Startups that connected me to you. So both of us play underwater hockey. It's a weird thing. Go Google it, and you love it if you try it. And that was actually how I got funding, was through underwater hockey. Just that was the initial network.
All right.
You never know.
Everybody should hear that. Word out to all VCs, angels, and wannabes that underwater hockey is the key to finding these nuggets. All right. Well, thank you, Anatoly. We'll get you a copy of this, and hope to see you again in post-COVID times. Enjoy Lake Tahoe. I'll be getting back up that way myself.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Take care.